Kids do that.
I have a high paid except for my teeth.
Scream like a little baby.
Well, shalom, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started with the Midrash. But before we do, just remember to do what Yah said in Devarim 8, verse 10 says, "You'll eat and be satisfied, and you'll bless Adonai your God for the good land He has given you." Let's do that. We've eaten and we're satisfied. We thank you for the land. It's in Yeshua's name we thank you. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are in Hebrews chapter 4 through 6 for this week 43 Midrash, week 43 since Sukkot. So begin with the prayer from Psalm 19, which reads this way: "The words of my mouth, the meditation of my heart be pleasing before you, O Yahweh, my rock and my redeemer." Psalm 19. So first couple slides here are kind of overview slides from last week's study, which was Hebrews chapters 1 through 3. We discussed, one of the things we discussed rather was authorship, and authorship, as you know from the youth challenge today, the correct answer is the Ketuvim Netzrim book of Hebrews doesn't actually tell us who wrote this book, but proposals include Paul, or Shaul, of course, Barnabas, Apollos, Silas, Priscilla, Clement of Rome, or that it was simply done anonymously. One view is that Paul or Shaul wrote it, but he intentionally kept his authorship as being anonymous because he knew that if his name was associated, that Jewish discrimination would make it so that the book would be not read because of his low level of esteem within the Jewish community at the time. And he wanted to enjoy any Jewish prejudice against the letter, which would had come if they had known that he wrote it. Again, that's one view. Mm-hmm.
What are the dates on the Hebrew when it was written?
The dates of authorship would be sometime before 66 of the Common Era, near the end of that time period, probably.
After 66.
Yeah, it was understood to be at least before. 66 is the dates typically given that I recall, but before 70, because there's no mention of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the text of Hebrews. We discussed the Messianic context of Hebrews 1:5 within the Judaisms, plural, of the first century and later Talmudic interpretations. And these nest with the argument put forth about the Messiah by the author of Hebrews. In other words, this is from the PME, the Practical Messianic Edition. "For to which of the angels did he ever say, 'You are my son, today I've begotten you, and I will be a father to him, and shall be a son to me'?" And both these passages in rabbinic writing, as well as in the Qumran texts, are listed as, in other words, 2 Samuel 7 and Psalm 2:7 are both listed as Messianic passages, or passages talking about the Messiah, which, of course, the book of Hebrews does as well. And this is from the idea, this is a quote from the Midrash, Talmud Bavli, that is referencing the same thing. It says, "The Holy One, blessed be He, will say to the Messiah, son of David, ask of me anything, and I'll give it to you. As is stated, I will surely tell you the decree of Yahweh. This day have I begotten you. Ask of me, I'll give you the nations as your inheritance." So the "this day I have begotten me," if you look back here, you see "today begotten thee" comes from Psalm 2:7, quoted by Hebrews in this book, but also, of course, it's a psalm. And that phrase was written as a messianic passage. We see blatantly here, it says Messiah, son of David, and that's in the Talmud. So the book of Hebrews isn't making that up as an understanding that that is, in fact, a messianic passage. Continuing on, we mentioned that the Judaism was plural. This is a text from Qumran. They also understood the psalm as being a messianic psalm. This is talking, not Psalm, in this case, it's 2 Samuel. Moreover, Yahweh declares to you that he will make you a house, and that I will raise up your offspring after you, and establish the throne of this kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be my son. Those are all passages out of 2 Samuel chapter 7. And then the commentary from Qumran says this passage refers to Tzemach David, or the shoot of David. That's from 4Q 174 within the Qumran texts, K4 scroll 174. Right. And so we went over the 7 rules of Hillel last time. And these are they: Chol v'chomer, the light and the heavy, the Gezerah Shavah, the equivalence of expressions, Binyan Av Mikatuv Echad, building of the Father from one text. That's the first 3. Now numbers 5 and 6. Binyav Av Mishnei Ketuvim, Binyav Av Mishnei Ketuvim, building of the Father from 2 or more texts. Ketuvim are words, as the literal translation of that. And Kalal Ufret Umparat V'Lakal, Vekalel is the general in particular, and the particular and the general. Kalal Ufrat Umparat Vekalel. And this is teaching from a general principle to a specific one, or the other way around. But often a statement is a general statement is first made, followed by specific remarks, which applies this principle of interpretation. The 6 and 7 of the rules of Hillel, Kayotza bo Makom Achar, analogy made from another passage, and Devar Halamed Me'inyano, which is the explanation obtained from context, or a matter that is learned from its own subject. A word that is learned from its own subject would be kind of a literal translation of number 7 there. So total context applies, not just isolated statement. You have to have that, so it's not considered to be eisegesis. So for actual exegesis, this is what's used. Explanation obtained from context, and context is clear. Okay, so those are the 7 rules of Hillel. Did a bit of review of what we talked about last week. It's on to Hebrews chapter 4, unless, well, sorry, one more thing. I forgot about this one. This is a kind of a highlight. We mentioned this as the passage. This is from Hebrews 2:1. Because of this, we have to pay more attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away. Why does it say it? Because there's a good chance of drifting away. And this is actually the first of 5 exhortations in this book to drift away, either through complacency, or apathy, or neglect. So that's what we're talking about here in terms of the book of Hebrews. Is, I mean, if the author says something 5 times, he's pretty much stomping his foot. It's like a test question, right? Don't drift away. He's trying to emphasize that point. And he does that for the first time in Hebrews 2, verse 1. Now we're on to Hebrews 4, unless there's any questions or comments before we go on to that of what we talked about previous weeks or anything else. So, okay, Hebrews 4. So I'm starting here in verse 4, but if there's anything that someone would like to look at before we get there, certainly I'm open to, this is a Midrash. You're supposed to, Midrash to discuss, to study. And the quotation is from the second half of this passage. And Elohim rested on the 7th day from all his work, which is a gloss back from the book of Bereshit or Genesis, where the Hebrew text of Hebrews adds Elohim, and instead of he in the passage in Genesis 2:2, he completed his work and he rested. So this Hebrews is using the second half of Genesis 2:2, which says, and he rested on the 7th day, whereas the book of Hebrews reads Elohim in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew text of Hebrews, as well as the Greek and Aramaic text also have the same gloss. You're reading Theos from the Greek and Eloah from the Aramaic. So they all use the same gloss. They agree with each other, where it says, and your English translation is probably something like and Elohim and God rests on the 7th day from all his works, which is not a direct quote from Genesis 2:2, but it is a gloss on it, because the Hebrew from that passage just says, and he rested on the 7th day from all his works. But of course, the context is beginning of 2:2, it says, and or by the seventh day Elohim completed his work. So, anyways, let's say just a note that the quotation from here your note might say Genesis 2:2, but really is a gloss on it because it does, it emphasizes for the author's purpose what he wants to talk about, and is resting on the seventh day. And this passage here in chapter 4 is part of the discussion that Shaul, or the author, whoever he is, makes about rest and Shabbat rest. So in this passage, as I said, there's a lot about rest in here. So let's take a look at this. How do these pictures of rest fit together? So you have your Bible open. 4:4 talks about rest. Well, really 4:3 does as well, but 4:3 and 4:4 talk about the rest. There's also verse 4, verse 9, a remains to be entered into in the future. So the question is, what kind of rest is this? What kind of rest is going on here in this passage? We talk about rest there, and what about this type of rest that Yeshua is talking about in Matthew chapter 11? Come to me, all you labor and are burdened, and I shall give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble in heart. You shall find rest for your beings, or for your souls. For my yoke is gentle and my burden is light. So taken together, what kind of rests are we talking about here in these passages, as well as reaching back to Yeshua's words in the Gospel of Matthew? What do you think? So I think that when we look at it, we see that there is I wouldn't say it's a challenge, but the passage that brings this together, I think, is in chapter 4, verse 8 and 9. Because it says this, for if Yehoshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later of another day. So there remains, according to the complete Jewish Bible, a Shabbat keeping for God's people. So the rest of entering into the land, the kind of rest that Yehoshua was giving Israel was a kind of rest that when they entered into the land, it was resting from fighting and having to conquer the land, resting from fighting with the enemies who wanted to throw them out of the land. That is a type of rest. And I think looking at what we see from these passages together is that the type of rest of entering the land and even of Shabbat rest on a weekly basis is a type and shadow of a future rest that's given. So an analogy, I think, could be made between the land of Israel and Hashemayim. The land of Israel and the heavenly realm. Just as Shabbat is a type and shadow of the rest being spoken of in the future, in the Olam Haba, in the Shemayim, in the heavens.
Sure.
And so that is, I think, part of what we're talking about here. And the same thing from Yeshua's passage in Matthew. That come to me, all you labor and are burdened, I'll give you rest. Well, it's both, he's talking now, but Yeshua is also talking forward into the future as well. And I think this passage in Matthew is even more indicative of the future. But Yeshua is talking to people in the now, telling them this now. Come to me, all you labor and are burdened, and I shall give you rest. He's saying that to people who are living right now, talking to them in Israel, in the land, as he's giving his message. So he's talking to it right now, but also speaking of, I'll give rest for your nefesh, your soul, so to speak, nafshot. For my yoke is gentle, my burden is light. That's talking about a future event, I think. So you can look at it that the rest, I think that drawing this together, and I think there's some different, well, I will say there's different renderings of Hebrews 4:9. And some renderings are designed to give the idea that Hebrews does away with the weekly Sabbath. But I think that goes against the whole analogy that the author is making here, and against the direct writing in the word from chapter 4, verse 9. And so there remains a Sabbath keeping for God's people. I think it's a pretty good way of rendering that. What are some other ways that your versions, I'm reading this Bible I have in front of me is a complete Jewish Bible. I know you have a different one. How does yours read for that passage? Do you have that handy?
Which one?
It's Hebrews 4:9.
While he's pulling that up,
Therefore-
go ahead.
Mine says, there remains therefore a rest for the people of God.
Okay.
Cece says, I was thinking rest is what Yah did in his creation. He created order out of chaos and then rested and called it good. Our life, we're doing his work in the world now, and we will also enter into his rest at the end after we have run our race. It's a now and future thing.
Good job.
Sometimes it's a physical thing, but it's also emotional and spiritual.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Sure.
When you're stressed out, I mean, you've been doing everything, and then you're like, and now it just gives you rest. And it peace of heart. My mom was that person.
So are they pictures of each other? I think the answer is yes. That would be a short answer to my question. What kind of rest being spoken of? They're pictures of each other that one leads to the other, and they're types and shadows of each other. Okay, so moving to chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. We talked a little bit about that a minute ago. Here's the whole passage. For if Yehoshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later of another day. So there remains a Shabbat keeping for God's people. For the one who has entered God's rest is also rest from his own work as God did from his. So that the here and now, the work is part of it. Therefore, let us do our best to enter that rest so that no one, will fall short because of the same kind of disobedience. So what do you think he's talking about here when he says that same kind of disobedience? What's going on there? Well, think about. Go ahead, Diddy.
So if we're reading, he starts off talking about Yehoshua had given them rest. He's talking about the disobedience that they experienced the entire time they were in the wilderness. They continued to. They'd test and they'd fail. They'd test and they would fail. So that type of disobedience, actually.
I think when you bring in Yehoshua, that's talking about conquering the land and then that rest, or conquer the land and then resting. But one thing that, in terms of disobedience and Shabbat, is concerned, of course, is on the land rest side of it, right?
Oh, sure.
Israel didn't ever let their land rest in accordance with the commandment.
Every
Seventh year, as well as the Yovel.
Yeah.
And so that caused them to be kicked out of their restful home.
And Cece says there are two patterns, obedience and disobedience.
So my comment at the bottom is, what we learn from the section is that Yehoshua leading the children of Israel into the land of Israel, the type and shadow of an even better rest. Mishnah Tamid 7:4 calls this future rest Yom Shekalo Shabbat, a future day or time that will all be Sabbath.
Yeah. Is that from that song? I'm just kidding.
I
Sorry.
think it goes the other way, honestly. But Yom Shekalo Shabbat is a great song. Ron Woodruff did great on that one. So this is from the Megillah translation of the Peshitta. Peshitta, of course, Aramaic text of the Ketuvim Netzarim and Hebrews here as well. And the comment here, it's not too far from the Greek text from the CJB. The comment is, just as Elohim gave Israel the Shabbat, he also gives Israel a future rest for which to look forward to. And so the analogy from Shabbat and land rest, if Shabbat does not still exist, then either does that future rest still exist. In other words, you're doing an analogy on Shabbat and talking about Shabbat being, important. Then if you try to do away with that Shabbat and change that to just a future rest only, that destroys your analogy in the first place. So that if Shabbat doesn't exist, neither does a future rest.
CC also says, and just like in the Garden of Eden, we obey his pattern or rebel and think we can hide, but we are naked before him.
Yeah. Same thing with disobedience, get thrown out of the land, get thrown out of the garden as well, get thrown out of Gan Eden.
Yep.
All right, continuing then with, this is the New King's translation for comparison. For if Joshua had given them rest, they would not after spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for people of God. So all these translations together, no matter what commentary you're looking at, all agree that there remains a rest for the people of God. And Stern included the word Shabbat in there because the subject is Shabbat rest, and so he put there remains a Shabbat keeping. But the idea of it is, I think this is not a direct translation, but it does give kind of a targum of that verse to bring it in. For he who has injured his rest does himself also cease from his works, as God did from his. So, and we're ceasing from works is something that involves a weekly Sabbath or just a Sabbath. And so entering that rest is still about Shabbat. So my view, though, here in the comment is that Christian commentators, whoever, must believe it's a bad analogy that the author of Hebrews is making, because the Sabbath for them, they believe it to be a burdensome work of the law. And so when Matthew Henry's commentary, for example, says, every true believer hath ceased from his own works of righteousness and from the burdensome works of the law, as God and Christ have ceased from their works of creation and redemption. So it seems that from a classic Christian commentary, they believe that the phrase there remains therefore a rest for people of God is inaccurate. It really doesn't remain that way, because that has to be done away with in terms of their understanding of making that a rest on Shabbat to be a burdensome work. Do any of you find resting on Shabbat to be a burdensome work?
No.
It's quite the opposite.
It's a guideline for you. It's protection.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just physical protection.
It's protection. Yep. There's a
It irritates me.
for something like this. Shabbat has kept Israel more than Israel's kept Shabbat.
Yeah.
I think that's keeps them together. All right. Continue on there to the next passage down, Hebrews 4:12 through 14. This is from the Complete Jewish Bible. See, the word of God is alive, it is at work, and is sharper than any double-edged sword. It cuts right through to where soul meets spirit and joints meet marrow. And it's quick to judge the inner reflections and the attitudes of the heart. Before God, nothing created is hidden, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must render an account. Therefore, since we have a great Kohen Gadol who has passed through to the highest heaven, Yeshua, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we acknowledge as true. And so this begins the argument that really carries through into next week's readings in chapter 7 about the order of Melchizedek and Yeshua's role in Psalm 110, and the idea of Yeshua's priesthood being of the order of Melchizedek, and not a Levitical priesthood. Thoughts or comments on this as Yeshua as the great high priest? Well, then we go to chapter 5. And here's some interesting things about the idea of Yeshua as the great high priest. We talked a little bit about this last week. And this is just really talking like textual comparison versus really digging into the Melchizedek priesthood. But in the Aramaic text of the book of Hebrews, there's a distinction between Levitical priests and other priests. The Aramaic word there, kane, you recognize, I think, as a cognate of Cohen. But the word used for as a generic word for priest is kumrea, and that's the word that's used about Yeshua in the Aramaic text. It refers to him as kumrea, Rav kumrea, as it shows on the slide there. Rav kumrea is high priest, but it's not not a Cohen priest. If that makes sense. So that's from 5:1. And so here's how the text reads. It says, "For every high priest who is ordained of men, for men, concerning these things that are of God, to offer offerings and sacrifices for sin." So the word there for high priest is Rav Kumrea in the Aramaic text. Yes, question?
Oh, I was just gonna bring something into the fray here because the order of Melchizedek.
Yeah, go ahead.
My brother-in-law has brought up to me many times that in the Greek Septuagint, supposedly the Jewish sages have pushed back the number of years in the line leading up to Abraham so that they could make Shem out to be Melchizedek versus Yeshua. And I don't know if it's true or not. They said it's like off 100 years per person. So time span from the time of Noah and then Noah and them getting off the boat after the flood onward, he's saying that they lived longer because how does Shem all of a sudden live to be 400 or 500 years old, but succession people after him were living only 70, 100 years, but yet he went all the way to 500, I think, or something like that.
I'm not sure I can address your specific question, but the chronology does show that Shem and Abraham shared about 50 years of time together.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, from
I
the
think that's right.
Masoretic text. But he's telling me that from the Greek Septuagint, the Septuagint is different from the Masoretic text on this issue. I've never seen that.
I don't know how there'd be
Well,
okay. I mean, just saying, I know from the Hebrew text that, I mean, just based on the timelines of life from the Hebrew, from the Masoretic text, it does show there's a co.
Well, I know.
Yeah.
Let me bring up the one. Go that direction because it'd be easier to do that than it would be to. Okay. So.
You're saying in the Septuagint text that the timeline doesn't work for Shem to be alive at the same time as Abraham?
Exactly. These are the sons of Shem. I think it's 11. So Shem was 100 years old, begot Arphaxad. 2 years after the flood, Arphaxad. Shem lived 500 years, begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad was 35 years, begot Selah. After he begot, he lived 400 and so many years, but it's after 35 years, he had kids. And then Selah lived 30 years. What he's saying is in the Greek Septuagint, it should be that Arphaxad lived 135 years, then begot Selah. So I'm like, I've never seen the Greek Septuagint in that portion right there, so I don't know. I don't know where he's getting his information. I just wonder, because I know the Jewish sages want to put Shem as being Melchizedek when, for all intents and purposes, I believe it to be Yeshua.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you can tell. I mean, you're saying that the Masoretic text was changed to show it differently? Okay. Well, we can look at it. We can take a look at that. I don't have that
That's
up and
what
handy.
he's saying. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Is all kinds of stuff that comes up, but I was just curious because concerning Melchizedek, I believe to be the incarnate Messiah, Yeshua, to be Melchizedek. Just as I believe it was Yeshua that appeared to Gideon, it was Yeshua that appeared to Abraham when the two angels went off to Sodom and Gomorrah.
But I don't know that Shem being at the same time would make would preclude your belief. Right?
I just looked up my TV, and the first mention is right after, the first mention is right after Abraham rescues his,
Lot.
and rescues Lot. Make sure we can bring it out.
Well, I mean, if you go back to the timeline when he was born, he actually does. I mean, using the Hebrew text as a timeline, there's definitely some overlap between those two. I'm planning to talk more about the order of Melchizedek when we get to chapter 7, which is really important for that purpose. I do have a lot of things we can talk about for.
Well, so Jacob was 15 years old when Shem died, supposedly, according to the Masoretic text. So, but I'm just curious.
Well, so I mean that would be right then. If Jacob is 15 years old, that means Abraham is older than that, right?
You bet.
Yeah. Yeah, that means
That gives even further witnessing
Because Jacob's grandson.
their lives overlapped.
But if you used supposedly his timeline, they wouldn't overlap.
I have to take a look at the Septuagint to see.
Yeah.
I've personally not heard that before.
He gets crazy things.
If there's something to it, we'll find it. But
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, we'll take a look.
Yeah.
I'll roll that into my study on chapter 7 next week. So, one thing to consider though, just because the Aramaic text of Hebrews distinguishes between a Cohen and a non-Cohen, the text of the Torah actually doesn't just make that same distinction. It uses the same word Cohen for son of Aaron, but also of Potiphera and Jethro would be also considered Kohanim. So it's not surprising in my view that the Hebrew text of Hebrews uses the word Cohen to describe Yeshua instead of a different word. It's just a side note. And so, but in that sense, though, there's some odd things in Hebrews 5, but the Hebrew text of Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1 uses the phrase HaKohen HaGadol, which would of course be the high priest, about Yeshua, and it uses the word Cohen in Hebrews 4:14. But there's some different phrases for the use of high priest that I don't recall seeing anywhere else. And in fact, I couldn't even find the words there in some cases. The words that either are Kog in 5:1 or Bog in 5:3. I couldn't find a Hebrew word that would mean that. The word used there, Kan Hanchak, would be, or Kog Hanchak. The word Kog I couldn't translate, but Hanchak means the taken. My thought, and this is just a thought here, is it could be, an abbreviation, almost like an acronym, shorthand, because what Hebrew words start with the word Kaf and Gimel? Well, Kaf is a word for Cohen, and Gimel is Gadol. So it could be a shorthand for Cohen Gadol in this text. I don't know. The initials, yeah. The word Bog I couldn't find as a meaningful word. Rock, of course, is a word for only, but it's translated as high priest. So I think that's a bit odd, but the word for Cohen is there or the word Cohen, not the word for Cohen, but the word Cohen is in Hebrews 5:6, talking about Yeshua, a Cohen forever after the order of Melchizedek. But anyway, some oddities in the Hebrew text of Hebrews here.
Do we find anywhere else, even in this book, where it's possible that they've used some kind of initials, or is this the only place?
I haven't found any place else, but as I go through the
You're
analysis,
also not saying that's the way it is. You're just
right? I'm guessing because I couldn't find.
It kind of makes sense.
I could not find a word that resembled that in the text of the Torah, and I couldn't find it in a dictionary either. So, if someone out there knows, please let me know. So this is basically a screenshot from a book, Ruach Kadim. It's by Andrew Gabriel Roth. He's an advocate for the Aramaic Peshitta text of Hebrews. He's making a comparison between the NIV on one hand, which represents the Greek text, and Lamsa's translation of the Peshitta, which has a different word there. And the difference is the Greek text has deal gently, whereas the Aramaic text of Hebrews have compassion. And so if you read those together, this is from the Greek text. He's able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. Is yours read anything different than that for Hebrews 5:2, Earl?
It says compassion.
Oh,
You
you
can
said?
have compassion.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Because this is basically saying, I think that your version may have been influenced, or this is just a gloss here. It says he says a nice straightforward reading in the NIV to be sure, but there is something wanting from it. There is mercy in both readings, but no humility in the Greek. In other words, the compassion part of it, proving once more that the Peshitta could not have been translated from that language. Eastern scribes simply did not carelessly leave important phrases like the one in the cutting room, that one on the cutting room floor. Rather, it seems much more likely that the Greek redactor of Hebrews did a little loose and sloppy targuming. We also found the umpteenth word in Aramaic that looks the same way in the singular or plural state, universally translated wrongly by the Greek traditions that were supposed to predate the Peshitta in the first place. And so, looking at it, the word that is different there is the word dynamic, which is a word humble, that doesn't actually appear in the Greek text. Humble, of course, not of course, but humble, that idea of humble is not actually in the Hebrew text of Hebrews either. So it's absent both the Hebrew text and the Greek text of Hebrews 5:2.
So the one in NIV, Greek,
Mm-hmm.
what word did they use for that one in Greek?
I didn't have to bring Greek up, so I don't know.
Because in the New King James, obviously, it says have compassion. So it seems to line up with the
With the Aramaic text, yeah.
yeah. Look that up in my Greek.
Okay, so there's a couple comparisons of Hebrews 5:12, which is sometimes used as a club against Torah observance. But here's what it says. Here's some of the translation from the Greek to the American Standard. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk, not solid food. And the Aramaic says something like, but by now you should be teachers because you have been a long time in training. But even now you need to be taught the first scriptures of the beginning words of Eloah. You are still in need of milk and not strong meat. So this doesn't say that the Torah is the elementary principles, but rather that the audience he's writing to, despite having a long time in training, as you see here in the Aramaic text, still needs to be taught the elementary principles of what? The Torah. Not that Torah itself is elementary, but that, in fact, those who are needing to be taught have to be taught it again because they apparently didn't take to it the first time, which seems odd in a way to me that you have a Torah teacher like Shaul, if he wrote it, whoever wrote it is very familiar with the Torah, telling Hebrews they haven't read the Torah, which seems almost like, your pride is based on your people group. Jews know the Torah. Why are you so ignorant of the Torah itself?
Mine has first principles of the oracles. So
The Aramaic text, you may recognize a couple of cognates. Ketibata is related to the Hebrew text, the word, ketuva, katav, writings. Kadmaita you may not recognize, but there's a phrase, Adam Kadmon in Hebrew, which is primordial or first Adam, so to speak. So this is the first scriptures. We may say the first scriptures might be talking about, Breshit to Devarim.
Out of mine, I still get the first principles of oracles of God. I still get the Torah. You can't get anywhere else but there.
Right. And so they need to be taught those first principles, even though presumably they've been learning them since they were children.
It's not such a far-fetched thing for someone to make that accusation, even because I have to believe that in every generation, people are people, no matter where you go. And I found that to be true just in my lifetime. No matter what country I visited, people are the same. They do things the same way. So if you just pick your favorite religious school. What's the one in Virginia there? Liberty University. These kids go to college there for, sometimes from they graduate from high school and they don't leave school until they've got their PhD. It doesn't mean they're ready for ministry. You know what I mean?
Right.
And same thing goes anytime. People. I'm in training for this. I've been going to a theological school, but
What's that one?
They're not anymore.
Chicago, the Moody Institute.
Moody Bible Institute.
Yeah, it's the same there too.
So it's just because they're doing that doesn't mean they're grasping what. I just got to get this piece of paper and then I'm done. It's basically it. So it's not too far-fetched for me for this accusation to be made, actually.
Well, take a look at this. Ken Ham, right?
Yes. Answers to Genesis.
Genesis.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing how much they put into that, but they still do not get the sound. I'm like,
the answer's there in Genesis, Ken.
I'm just saying. And then I watched the Moses controversy again this morning, and it came down to writing. And I was listening to each one of these guys and their deal, and they're right here. They're still in milk.
Yeah.
And some of them, I think they're drinking watered down milk. It's beyond reason. This relates to Southern Baptist University out of Kentucky, Lexington, and he's close, but he's still listening.
Sure.
It's like, how can you get this wonderful knowledge that, yes, Moses wrote it, and obviously there's no doubt, but how can you get here when you consider yourself a truth, but the first principles, the Torah itself, you cannot grasp anything?
It's also, you can also think about it too, in a room, a congregation full of people, not every single person in the room is, number one, even called to be a teacher. That kind of thing. So think of the Impact Center here. They call themselves a training center. Every person here, every member of their congregation is in training to become a minister of some sort somewhere else. But I look back and I have to ask myself, how many are actually training to be a minister, and how many people are just coming to church here? Mm-hmm. Same thing in Beit. If you think about it, I mean, over the years we've had, sometimes we're really huge and sometimes we're really small, but how many people actually come to learn how to teach the Torah to people? It's not very many. So
yeah.
And once again, we don't know who he's actually
right
given this to. So
yeah,
it seems though
could be a yeshiva full of people.
If you look at it from looking back at history that we have the advantage of doing, it does seem though that if you are being taught the Torah through one of the schools, mm-hmm. you're taught with that outlook, and Yeshua is a mind-blowing change to all of those schools' outlook. And so
that's a good point.
It makes sense that they have a hard time grasping it, perhaps, even if they've been taught it.
Sure.
I agree.
But
what
Phil's saying is, the lack of getting it though will have consequences later for the, when Shaul is executed and and Yochanan, the Revelator, dies. Paul's prophecy, if you will, that savage wolves would come and take over, which was probably made easier because even the Hebrews didn't get it, and they should have got it the most.
You bet.
Well, even during the life of Paul, he said that earlier.
Yeah. That's pretty good.
It's kind of a play on words here in the Aramaic text where it says beginning words, Dorishit Melohe. It's the same root word as milta, which is the Aramaic word for word used in John 1:1. So
Yeah.
the beginning words of God, so to speak, is even there's a reference to Yeshua in that phrase because of Yeshua being the milta. Okay. Continuing on to chapter 6. We talked about this during Oneg a little bit. Hebrews 6:2 we're talked about. This is 6:1 and 2. And it's interesting to me that in the Greek text, it does talk about the doctrine of baptisms or washings as the text of CJB translates it. But it's actually that way as well in Aramaic. But the Hebrew text of Hebrews reads a bit differently. It reads a foundation of immersions. Well, let's back it. For growing maturity to move in to establish a foundation of repentance from dead works by faith in Elohim, a foundation of immersions, of teaching, of laying on of hands, of resurrection of the dead, and from everlasting judgment. So the difference is that in the Hebrew text of Hebrews, it doesn't say a doctrine of immersions or baptisms. It says of immersions of teaching and doctrine being similar concepts or words. And so it adds, essentially it's of teachings, of baptisms, and of laying on the hands. Those are three things in the Hebrew text, but only two in the Greek, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So comment at the bottom of the slide, the others are just smaller text. The Greek text says that we should leave the principles of the doctrine of Christ, while the Hebrew only says that we should move beyond a mere study of the life of Yeshua.
The Greek text says that we should leave
It says, therefore, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ, let us go on to perfection. When you think about it, that seems to be a not very fundamental or a not very complimentary thing. And it could be interpreted as leaving them behind because that doesn't get us to perfection, so to speak. The principles of the doctrine of Christ in the Greek text, leaving those. Well, we really don't want to leave that. He just says that's essentially milk, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But you should already have known it, but not really leaving it as in leaving it behind.
Right.
You want
Part of your foundation.
It's
So
a
it's time to
foundation.
move on.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I guess so. So of 6:2, I mentioned that there's another difference in that between Greek and Hebrew, in that the text says move on from 6 foundations, while the Hebrew text says 7. Just mentioned that. The Greek text says doctrine, teaching, and baptisms as one foundation, while the Hebrew text understands this as 2 separate foundations, immersion and teaching. Well, the Peshitta agrees with the Greek text on this against the Hebrew there. So Greek and Hebrew the Greek and the Aramaic agree together that it should be doctrine of washings. We discussed that washings or immersions, but if there's one immersion, then this is talking about something else besides the immersion. It's a doctrine about purification, perhaps you could say. And what would be some other purifications or immersions that would be going on? We have
Holy Spirit, I guess.
possibly.
I still think it's referring to the mikvahs in the sense that
But see, I guess the question would be, how does that make a teaching or a doctrine? No.
there are many different doctrines on Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
There
Okay.
is. I mean, you go to the Catholic school of principles, and what? Boom, you get sprinkled. Well, you just slide right on down through the Lutherans, until you finally end up Pentecostal. You don't. But that's what I mean. There's so many different doctrines on how you're baptized and when. I mean,
But I don't think that was the case
baby.
necessarily. I mean, maybe it was in Shaul's day if he was the author.
I don't know.
Um,
That's just my thought. I'm not saying that's exactly what it said. I'm just saying
mhm.
it appears to me this is where what it's talking about, because then you have the laying on hands and things of this nature. So if the resurrection of the dead and eternal judgment, so that's why it's listing out these different ones. Maybe in his time there were differences of a baptism, a mikvah.
Well, I'm thinking out loud here, but I could be wrong certainly. But when you look at the time this was written, it was written to people who supposedly should have known what the Torah says. And in chapter 5, he's talking about the Torah, and it seems to me that the doctrine of immersions or washings, and since we think this was written before the destruction of the temple, could be in temple times in terms of after you are immersed, are you still immersed before you go to the temple?
Yeah.
I would say yes, you are.
give you that. I mean,
Are you immersed after you've been in contact with a dead body?
Yeah.
Does being immersed with and using the ashes of the red heifer, does that go against the immersion of either the rock or even of Yochanan HaMatbil, John the Baptist?
No.
I don't think it does either. I guess someone could argue that, well, there's only one baptism, we shouldn't be immersed again because of that. And so, I mean, there could be some controversies to
I
that.
see what you're
I don't
saying.
know.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That could sway me the other way for sure. But
I'm just, again, I'm not trying to convince. I'm just thinking out loud.
I got it. I'm good with it.
Okay. Continue on then.
Trying to keep it open.
Hebrews 6:13. So, Hebrews chapter 4 and 5, we see Midrash and Yeshua as high priest of the order of Melchizedek, Abraham and David in Psalm 110. So the Midrash continues here in 6:13, which reads, this is from the Hebrew text. For Elohim, having promised Abraham, while he had none greater to swear by, swore by himself, saying, blessing, I will bless you, and multiplying, I will multiply you. And so this is a reference going back to Bereshit or Genesis chapter 22, which reads this way in the King James. And I said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, and as a seed which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemy. So I'm going to go back a slide now to Hebrews 6:13 and 14, which is it's a gloss or a reference back to the phrase in Genesis 22, which is, what's the context of that phrase in Genesis 22? Do you recognize that?
Mhm.
Okay. What is it?
What's the content?
Yeah, what in Genesis 22, being referenced here in Hebrews 6, what is the context of Genesis 22?
I think it's Messiah.
Well, I think it's we're talking about the binding of his son.
Yeah.
So,
Well, in 22, it's the binding of Isaac.
Right.
yeah.
But
So the reference that is being made is about the binding of Isaac.
yes.
In other words, still going back to Abraham as being
Right.
a primary player in this midrash. So the reference to the binding of Isaac is that in where it says in the blessing part of it. The blessing, I will bless you, multiply, I will multiply you, and multiply your seed. So that idea is taken, the passage in Hebrews 6 is taken from the passage in Bereshit about the binding of Isaac. And that's specifically what it says. The angel of Adonai called to Abraham a second time out of heaven. He said, I've sworn by myself, says Adonai, that because you have done this, because you haven't withheld your son, your only son, I will most certainly bless you, and I will most certainly increase your descendants to as many as are stars in the sky, or grains of sand on the seashore. So when you think about it, the idea of Abraham not, willing to sacrifice his only son is exactly what Yah did,
Yep.
who did sacrifice his only son.
Yep.
And that's what Hebrews is about. It's almost like you can look at the general to the particular, or the particular to the general in that sense, and that this one case, the first one who did it was actually Abraham,
Yes.
but it was really the type and shadow of what Yah would do later. In other words, the small picture was of Abraham. The big picture is what Yah does with his son.
Yes. Hence is why I said he was the context.
Yes.
In Hebrews.
Mm-hmm. And so the Midrash about Melchizedek continues here in chapter 6. And these two passages, I think, are, these two passages kind of bring it together at the end of chapter 6. So we have this hope as a sure and safe safe anchor for ourselves, a hope that goes right on through what is inside the Parochet, where a forerunner has entered on our behalf, namely Yeshua, who has become a Kohen Gadol forever, to be compared with Melchizedek. And so there may be some different renderings of that, but it is talking about Yeshua as the priest in the order of Melchizedek. And then the Kohen Gadol, again, we talked about the Hebrew part there. That is it is Hebrew that says Kohen in there. So it would be Kohen is in the Hebrew text of Hebrews. So this chapter concludes with the stating that Yeshua had previously entered behind the veil on our behalf as the Kohen HaGadol of the order of Melchizedek or Melchizedek. And in my view, this leads to chapter 7, which really talking about, what gets into, I think, the heart of the book here. Chapter 7 through 10, in my view, is the heart of the book of Hebrews. That's the main teaching of the book of Hebrews, which will get started on next week with chapter 7 through 9. Here's what we're looking at in future weeks here. 7 through 9 is next Shabbat. 10 through 13 it concludes Hebrews on the 6th of August. And then we go in sequence First Peter, 2 Peter, and then 1 John. What are your questions? I didn't ask you what was your favorite color.
Yeah, it was Melchizedek, actually, in the next chapter, in chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
it specifically says there's no record of his father, mother, ancestry, birth, or death. Rather, like the Son of God, he uses the calling for all time. So I actually find that statement makes it less likely that he was studied in his chapter. Based on the fact that the point was that he himself made a name for himself, and it has nothing to do with his ancestry.
Because we do know the connection I would say, though, is, well, we know the genealogy of Shem, but we also know the genealogy of Yeshua from the Gospels.
When Yeshua stayed with the temple at 12 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and the parents came back and said, "How did you miss us?" And all that. It's like, "Don't you volunteer for Father's will?"
Mm-hmm.
And that's also not that. And it's like, "Where's my brother?" What was the name? Yeah, at the time, Shem would have been in his 300s.
Okay.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that he was the most epic, and that he was considered that's like associating work or something. Like the theories people have that all of Shakespeare's work are actually written by some guy named Beit. Associating something.
Or the Earl of Essex.
Just because know them better.
So Hebrews is, the only place where it says Melchizedek is without father with him.
It's looking at the text, and really, in my view, we haven't got to chapter 10 yet, but it's making a midrash
Yeah.
on that fact. That it's a midrash on the fact that the scriptures don't say specifically where Melchizedek came from.
Right.
And that's the idea. That we know, because we know in terms of what the gospel says about Yeshua's genealogy. So it's just, in other words, it's a midrash on the subject, not necessarily stating it as we don't know the genealogy of Yeshua.
That's where it doesn't say, so.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments before we close? All right, well, let's pray. We do thank you for allowing us to midrash on your word here in freedom in this country. We ask you to be giving us wisdom this week, to walk out your word, walk out your scriptures. We thank you in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen.